Howdy Airshow fans, this is Thom Richard with a P-40 and Warhawk here behind me, built by Curtis. We're at Oshkosh 2022 and we're showcasing this fantastic machine here this year. This one belonged to a Florida couple, Ed and Marsha Wilsey. This is not our aircraft that we train in normally. This is a new restoration, and this just won Grand Champion Sun and Fun 2022. So in regards to the aircraft itself, the P-40 was a air superiority fighter that was designed to defend the homeland, the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, against a foreign invasion. That was the purpose of the aircraft. So it's a air superiority fighter and ground air support aircraft. So it's an excellent dogfighter at low altitude. It is not an escort fighter. A lot of people want to compare them to later escort fighters. Completely different mission. That's not what this airplane was built for. This was a low altitude, down and dirty dogfighter with the capability of carrying a 1,000-pound bomb on the center line. So a very utilitarian aircraft. It served every single day in every single theater of the war. No other fighter has that record. So the end model is powered by a Allison 1710-99, puts out 1,325 horsepower takeoff. It does have a supercharger capable of producing about 61 inches of manifold pressure at 3,000 RPM. The propeller on the front is normally a Curtis Electric. This one has been upgraded to a Hamilton Standard. That is a approved modification that we do these days to the aircraft to keep them serviceable. You can't really tell by looking at it. They are pretty much identical. People ask all the time about the three ports in the front of the aircraft. The two top ones are the radiators. We're a water-cooled engine, the bottom being the oil cooler. And 25% of the cooling, believe it or not, is done by the oil on the Allison, unlike a Merlin, for example, which is, I think is 12 or 13% or something like that. So it sports one of the largest spinners on fighter, which makes it quite streamlined. It's an excellent diving aircraft. Down low, below 10,000 feet and 250 indicated. There are few aircraft that can beat it in any regard. It's this fantastic, very spunky little airplane. I call it a Pitts with 1,300 horsepower. Oh, yeah. So we regulate the temperature manually with a big lever in the cockpit called a cow flap handle. It's on the right side, and it takes care of these feathers right here. And so it varies the exit air from the three coolers. Some earlier versions also had a louver system specifically on the two radiators, not the oil cooler, so you could get a differential between the two. On the end model, they removed that system for weight. They actually stripped a lot of stuff off the end model to make it lighter, about 500 pounds of things on the lightweight end model to make it even sportier than the earlier versions. The landing gear is kind of interesting on the P-40. It retracts aft, which is very unconventional. It was an early design, came from the P-36 Hawk. It's hydraulic, so it's got two independent hydraulic actuators, which is why you see them retract at different rates all the time. They rotate 90 degrees to get into the wheel well, and what happens is whichever gear moves first is the one that's going to capture more air and is actually going to be pushed out into the wheel well faster than the other one. And it's arbitrary as to which one goes up first. When you put them down, they tend to come down fairly evenly because it's working hydraulics against the air pressure. There's no gear door other than the one for the landing gear strut itself. The wheel wells are exposed behind this cavity. So if you look at the design, the landing gear is actually bolted underneath the wing, and it's got a fairing around it. So this is not aerodynamically very advantageous, but it was great for structure. So they put the entire landing gear strut outside of all the spars. The aircraft has multiple spars on the wings and even more on the tail, so it's virtually impossible to take it out with a single flak hit. So you can't break a wing by getting hit, like you see the footage of the B-24, for example. So it's a very sturdy aircraft. They came back with tons of battle damage on these things. They were very difficult to shoot out of the sky. That was also another theory at the design theory at the time, was to put the coolers up by the engine where they're a lot more protected versus the middle of the aircraft, like they did in the Mustang later on for aerodynamic reasons. They also figured they would operate the aircraft on very unimproved dirt strips with rocks flying around, so they didn't want the coolers on the belly. They wanted it up front, so there was little chance of FOD. It turned out that really wasn't that big of a problem in the 51. That was actually a better solution. But early on, this was the design theory. The exhaust, this is called a fishtail. There's a couple of different versions of this exhaust, but this is the fishtail, and this was designed specifically for noise and visibility reasons. They wanted to be quieter, and they wanted the flame pattern to disappear. So that's why it's spread out like this. So this was actually a mod that was done later on. Originally, they had the round exhaust ports, and they added the fishtails to make the aircraft less conspicuous. The aircraft is equipped with 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 325 rounds per gun, so at a firing rate of 900 per gun, it's a pretty significant punch, and it's less than 20 seconds of ammo, which is not a lot in combat, so you really had to pay attention when you pull that trigger. It also had underwing stores, so you could hang rockets and bombs and drop tanks on the wings, as well as the centerline shackle. So we have no shackle installed on this particular aircraft, but you'll see them on some of the other P-40s, where you can put a drop tank all the way up to 150 gallons. There was a configuration with 3 large tanks and the ferry tanks in the aircraft, where the aircraft go 3,100 miles at very, very low power settings. Would have been an excruciating trip, but it was possible. So they rarely did that. The P-40 is not known for range. That's not its purpose. It carries very little fuel normally. And obviously in that configuration there was no armament or anything else in the airplane. It was just fuel for ferrying the aircraft.
Landing gear indicator?
The landing gear has a over-center indicator. We call these soldiers. And it's got a mark on the back where the pilot can see it, and it indicates that the link edge goes over center, and you can then put weight on the strut. The locks are internal to the hydraulic strut itself, and it's quite a complex retraction and extension procedure, and it's also quite lengthy. So it's a very archaic system, and you got to pay attention to it, because most P-40s have been on their belly from pilot error. So you really be careful. It's not just a simple up and down switch like we have in most aircraft today. This was a very early design, obviously. So the way the system works is the strut has a set of dogs inside, so when you put pressure on one side, it'll extend all the way and they will lock in place internally to the strut. When you apply pressure from the other side, the dogs will collapse and push it the other direction. It will lock in the other direction. So it's a solid, very stout system, but you have to wait for that to happen. And the only way you can really tell, other than there is a little switch and the gear lights, of course, but the way you can tell that the landing gear is actually locked in place is by means of the hand pump. So what you do after the electric pump, which is a little pinky switch on the trigger switch up on the stick, you'll see here in a minute, once the cycle is complete, what you do is you take your hand off the controls and hand pump, and you can feel the hydraulic pressure build, and when you lock it into the neutral position, it stiffens up, and that's how you can tell that the gear is down. Realize you got to do this traveling at 175 miles an hour around the pattern while looking for traffic to deal with ATC. So it's a very, very busy cockpit in the pattern. It's also a very difficult airplane to slow down. It doesn't have any speed brakes. The wing is a traditional wing. It turns really well. Head hangs on. It takes an awful lot to make the aircraft stall. Pitot tube is on the left wingtip. Nothing fancy. Standard off-the-shelf parts. The P-40 is well known for its roll rate. The ailerons are fantastic. It's probably the fastest rolling fighter in the inventory, and it's very light on the controls. It's a lovely, lovely aircraft to fly. These flaps are split flaps. You can only see them on the bottom. They create quite a bit of drag, not a whole lot of lift, but it was a preferred design at the time. The plane flaps and fire flaps obviously came later. The ammo boxes are on the top. So these two lids come undone by means of piano wire, and the gun compartments are loaded from underneath. You shove the gun is from under. And you can also see the exit ports for the ejection chutes for all the links and spent brass. The wheel wells and the tail wheel compartment traditionally had skirts. You can see the fabric that protects the interior from mud splatters and that sort of stuff when you operate on unimproved fields. The fuel tanks are in between the two wing joints. There's two fuel tanks. There's a 55-gallon and a 35-gallon. We call it a main and a reserve. And all the fuel plumbing is external in the keel, so it's another part that's added to the outside of the wing. Normally a P-40 would have a fuselage tank, was an additional 67 gallons, and made a big difference for range. And then drop tanks, of course. This aircraft is one that's been modified with the service bulletin for 2 seats. So it has a second canopy installed, and the fuselage tank has been taken out. So right now this has fairly short legs because we don't have a lot of fuel on board. Inside the tail cone we got the battery, various controls, and the whole hydraulic mechanism. We have the hydraulic tank is serviced right here. Tail wheel is retractable, which was a fairly new thing at the time. The original P-40, all the earlier models were called short tails, and the Mike and the November models were called long tails. So what they did, they added a plug at this seam right here, about 20 or so inches, to move the rudder back. So you move the rudder in the vertical back, the horizontal and the tail wheel stays in the same place. The purpose of that was spin recovery, was no other reason. And as far as flying the aircraft, normally you can't tell the difference between a short tail and a long tail airplane. But for spin recovery, that was something they added later on. So the way you could tell the difference is whether or not the leading edge of the horizontal is lined up with the leading edge of the vertical on the short tail. On the long tail, they're split. All the control surfaces are fabric. The horizontal has 5 spars. The rudder has a ton of authority. We have pretty good tail wheel steering in this airplane, and it needs it because we have a very narrow landing gear. It's forgiving on the landing shocks, but it is relatively narrow, and with the dihedral, it's quite easy to get a wing up if you get in trouble with the crosswinds. So it's an airplane you really got to pay attention to. It's got a little bit of an unusual hinge situation up here, and it's got some aerodynamic balancing, as you can see. So it's quite nice. The aircraft also had lower frequency antennas that attached on the horizontal out onto the wingtip. They had these wires they would clip on for that purpose. Some have even had a mast behind the cockpit and went to the tail as well. So there's all kinds of different configuration for communications. This particular airplane was a Burma Banshee aircraft flown by a gentleman by the name of Hickson. So they supported the hump with this airplane, and this airplane was involved in a landing accident and wasn't recovered until the 90s, and then subsequently restored, and here we are today. It's been probably 20 years of restoration work on this aircraft altogether, and it did fly a few years back, but it wasn't quite done yet, so it was taken back down for another 4 or 5 years of restoration, and we just finished it this spring. We managed to win Grand Champion Sun and Fun with this machine, which we were very pleased with, and it's turned out to be a wonderful flying airplane. We have a whopping 26 hours on the airplane now since January, and it had a beautiful flight up there, no squawks whatsoever.
Up in the car.
Yep, let's go hop inside and take a look what the office looks like. So, in the P-40 cockpit, you're actually sitting right on top of the wing. This is the wing structure. Right on, the cockpit floor is the wing itself. There's no subfloor, and you're not elevated like you are, for example, in the Mustang that has a subfloor. So you're sitting very low onto the wing, which is a nice place to be, but it has some visibility limitations, of course. The fuel gauges are on the floor. There's 2 of them for one of the 2 tanks. And if we go left to right to start back here, this yellow handle is the flap selector. Flaps are hydraulic, and the hydraulic pump is electrically driven by the pinky switch on the stick right here. This is how you activate the hydraulic pump. It is not a PTO on the engine. Then the landing gear handle is here. This is the only safety on the entire system. If you were to bring this up on the ground, the tail wheel will retract right now. So there's no safety in that. And there's certainly no squat switch. The N model only has elevator and rudder trim. The aileron trim was removed for weight. And frankly, it doesn't really need it. So that was probably a good move. The throttle quadrant is traditional. We got the friction lock, the propeller lever, the mixture, which is auto lean, auto rich. The full rich has been omitted by tech order, and of course the throttle itself with the push to talk switch. This safety is the war emergency override. Fuel selector is just in front of the throttle quadrant. In this case, it's pretty simple with just the 2 tanks in the off position. This instrument panel is not quite stock, although this particular piece is the original instrument panel. It's been upgraded, of course, with some modern avionics to keep the aircraft safer, and the switch setup is different. Carb heat, very important on an Allison. It is prone to carb icing, so if you run around in the clouds, you definitely need to use it. The canopy crank is operated by hand, and this little lever right here is to keep it unlatched so you can close it and open it when you're not flying. Hydraulic hand pump. The original models, they had 2. We only have 1 on the end. Again, they omitted for weight. So the emergency gear down system was eliminated on the N model for weight. Kind of interesting. The aircraft has the cow flap handle. This is talk about something that looks like from a locomotive from the 30s, right? So you have an unlocking mechanism with a trigger, and then you set the cow flaps as necessary based on the temperatures you're reading on your instruments. They removed the seat adjustment, so the only way you can adjust the height is by cushion. So they eliminated a lot of things on the N model to make it really light and spunky. Visibility is severely restricted because of the high nose. It's got a little higher deck angle than the average tail dragger of the era, but also you have the intake on top of the engine, which does that adds to the visibility restrictions. But it's an absolutely fantastic aircraft to fly, very, very high performance. The flap speed is only 140. And the gear speed is only 175. Not having any speed brakes, it's rather difficult to slow this airplane down coming into the pattern, so it takes some planning. Most fighters, you can drop flaps at high speed and use them as speed brakes, like Mustangs, Corsairs, and so on. You can't do that here, so you got to plan a little bit more. And with a 20-second gear cycle, you really got to pay attention, and you can't get rushed in a situation like an air show, for example. So this aircraft has the 2-seat conversion, and it will have the dual controls eventually. The TP is what it was called, was a factory kit. They realized that people were cracking these things up left, right, and center in World War II, and they needed something they could teach their students in. So they came up with a conversion. They built 26 TPs at the factory, and they built 75 kits that they sent out into the field. And it's a fairly straightforward mod. You can actually take a 2-seat dual control kit, put it into an airplane, take the fuselage tank out, and then revert it back. You can take the controls out and drop the tank back in, which is pretty clever. So it's strictly a tech order from the factory, very simple, straightforward, not at all like a TF-51, which is a completely different airplane, for example. We appreciate you watching our little video here on the P-40 today. Enjoy Oshkosh, and we'll see you next year.